Hi, I'm Jackie Tantillo, and this is Should Have Listened to My Mother. My guest is an accomplished writer and professor at the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. Prolific in every way, he's written on topics as diverse as religion, racial divide, immigrants and American politics and teachers. In 1997, he was a finalist for the Pulitzer, and he's with us to talk about his book about his mother, entitled Who She Was, My Search for My Mother's Life. Hello, Sam Freedman, and welcome to Should Have Listened to My Mother.
Thanks so much, Jackie. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
We've had to reschedule this appointment to get this to work, and as I mentioned to you before we started the interview, I feel as though I've gotten to know you and your family quite well, but I know that's just, a ridiculous thing in my head. But when you have something as personal as the book that you wrote, Who She Was, and you share that with other people, it certainly opens the door to a wonderful perspective, especially the relationship with your mom. So I really want to thank you for me finding you and you writing that book. I thank you right out of the gate.
Well, I thank you for coming to me about it. This is a particularly dear book to me out of the 9 and now 10th in the works that I've done. And so I'm always especially gratified to be able to talk about this one.
So I initially found you from a New York Times article I found entitled About Men, A Mother's Presence, and then that led me to your book. Before we get into the story, how about if we share a little bit about your family members and you tell us your mom's name?
My mother's name was Eleanor Hatkin. She then obviously became Eleanor Freedman when she married my father, Dave Freedman. But throughout most of the book, which goes from her starting high school in 1938 to her marrying my father in 1953, she's Eleanor Hatkin.
And you have two younger siblings.
Yes, I've a younger sister, 10 and a half months younger, my Irish twin, Carol, and then my brother, 3.5 years younger than me, Ken.
And is Carol who you dedicated the book to?
Yes.
Can I read? Do you remember what you wrote to her in the dedication?
I do remember, but you can read it since you have it right in front of you.
Oh, my gosh. Some comfort, I hope, in another sorrowful season.
Yeah, I've dedicated it to Carol that way because obviously one of the sorrowful seasons was the year of our mother's death, and we were both teenagers, and my brother even younger than that. And it just happened that right at the time I was finishing writing the book, my sister's husband, a very beloved husband, George Squires, was dying, and after dying of lung cancer, the same disease that had killed our mother.
Oh, my goodness. Talk about a perspective. Words on a page can be just words on a page until you really know the full story. I'm so sorry. This is a very touching book that you wrote, but did you write it out of regret?
I wrote it out of a sense of remorse and shame, really. My mother died in 1974 when I was 19, and at the time she died, I was in the midst of that, as I know now, normal process of individuation that teenagers go through, and I think particularly boys go through vis-a-vis their mother, and, some sense of rejecting your mother to become yourself. But I was racked with guilt by that because at the time I was rejecting her, she was also dying, so it felt like pushing away someone, at the time when the chance to get to know her and be with her was dwindling. And that really haunted me and made for something very unreconciled in my soul for, decades and decades after that. As I write in the book, it was impossible after our family buried her in 1974. I found it impossible to go to the cemetery out of that sense of tremendous guilt that I had. And then it just was a coincidence of when an aunt of mine on my father's side died in December of 2000 that I ended up in the cemetery. And one of the relatives I was with said to me, let's go to Eleanor's grave. And that was the first time I'd been back. And that just kind of cracked open something in me and really made me feel like I had to do something productive with this kind of paralyzing and, in the end, passive sense of guilt or remorse that I had. And that was to decide to use what I knew how to do as a journalist, which was to tell someone's story, to recover the details of someone's life, and do that about my mother's life. And I think what's different from a lot of somewhat similar books is that I didn't write it primarily as a memoir because the things I remembered about my mother I didn't particularly need to recover. What I wanted to recover was what I had never thought to ask her, never been curious in knowing, which is, as the title says, who she was. In other words, who's this person, Eleanor Hacken, who was around and had this entire life before she became my mother. And that was the person I went in search of.
And how many of us have that same thought process that we don't really know who our mom was? Or, some of us are fortunate to have had the time to spend with our mom, to get to know them and really know who they were before they were mom. Totally different person for the most part. So again,
exactly.
I admire you being so honest because you realized you had made some mistakes. And what you had written when you went to the cemetery, you likened it to an archaeologist's instruments as far as reconstructing your mom's life. But as a journalist, you would use your pencils and your books and your computer. But you started really, no pun, the ground up to recreate who your mom was.
Yes. I mean, I just wanted to use whatever tools I had at my disposal to find her. And, it's a tricky thing when you go in search of a non-famous person. It presents a different set of challenges than writing about someone who has, been written about by other people, who's left an archive of some kind. Part of the challenge and also the satisfaction of writing this book was the kind of effort it took to find a life that was, in many ways, an ordinary life, or a prosaic life. I mean, my mother was, very much a star student and very attractive young woman with a lot of boyfriends during her years of coming of age, but she never did anything that was going to lead the world to write about her. And, interestingly, because she lived in this neighborhood of the Bronx where all of her best girlfriends literally were within a couple blocks of each other, she had these very, very deep, decades-long friendships with the girls turned women who had been her childhood friends, but they actually never needed to write to each other very much because they would see each other walking to and from school on Boston Road, or, going to Crotona Park on the weekend, or at USO dances during the war. So they had relatively little need to set down anything in writing. Fortunately, a lot of them, really all of them, were not only alive and well and possessed of great memories, but, very open in talking to me. And the other thing I should say, Jackie, that was really powerful was snapshots. I don't know what it's going to be like. Just like historians and biographers now wonder what's it going to be like to write biographies of people from the email era, because will people's emails be saved the way people hang on to the letters they wrote or the written journals they kept? And we don't know that. Similarly, I don't know what's going to happen to all the smartphone photos we're all taking.
Oh my gosh.
But in my mother's time, everybody took snapshots. And all these kinds of family events and personal events were commemorated with snapshots. And as I discovered, not only that, a lot of times there'd be dates written on the back, or locations or messages written on the back. So whether it was, my mother sending this very kind of cheesecakey photo of herself in a bathing suit to one of her boyfriends who was in World War II. She had two different ones fighting in the war at the same time, with this very kind of seductive message on the back about waiting for him to come back. And that was a photo he still had decades later and shared with me. Or whether it was a photo of my mother and her family in 1939 in their only good suits of clothes and good dresses. When I checked the date, I realized it was Rosh Hashanah, so I knew that they had been in Crotona Park to do the Jewish ceremony where you cast your bread on the waters, to get rid of your sins. It's called Tashlit. And I also realized that was right after the German invasion of Poland, in which my grandmother's family was ultimately virtually all exterminated. So just, one photo could yield all these amazing clues for me.
Absolutely. It's clues indeed. You're lucky to have been able to have pieced things together as nicely as you did. So let's talk a little bit about your mom. She, and please correct me if I'm wrong, she was brilliant, right? She's the oldest of three children.
Yeah, she was the oldest of three, and she was definitely an academic star. She skipped a couple of grades going through school, so she graduated from high school at 16 from Morris High School in the Bronx, and she was the valedictorian. And that was a very large school and also very academically accomplished school. I mean, disproportionately filled with these incredibly upwardly mobile and academically oriented Jewish immigrant kids. And she was the number one in her class.
And yet, you wrote in your book, Mom battered her way into the wider world, emerging bruised yet unbowed, and finally triumphant. In reality, Mom's life peaked at 17 and living to 50 with that knowledge. So there was a major turn of events, a couple of different turns of events in your mom's life, including the Great Depression, World War II, and the Holocaust, affecting your parents' families, especially your grandmother, Rose, right?
Exactly. I mean, one of the kind of tragedies within my mother's family's life was the way the events of the Holocaust really punished both my mother and my grandmother, and yet they ended up very much at odds with each other. And I'll come back to that in a second. But you're right that what happened to my mother between being this exhilarating, accomplished, adored person at age 17 in the sense of unfulfillment she had for much of her life thereafter was, first of all, as you point out, the Depression. I mean, kids had to grow up much faster then in general than children grow up now. In my mother's case, it was really magnified by the fact that her father, who I remember from my youth, my grandfather Saul, was a very sweet guy, but very ineffective as an earner, not able to really keep jobs. So the family was really living in poverty much of my mother's childhood. And once she hit her teens, she really had to become the chief breadwinner. She was a more reliable earner than her father was. And what that meant was that this great college scholarship she'd won as a valedictorian to go to Brooklyn College, she ultimately had to give it up because she had to switch to night school so she could work all day. And that was kind of one thing that really, deprived her from fulfilling her promises. And then the way the Holocaust fit into her family in a very intricate, very palpable way is, as I said, my mother's mother, my maternal grandmother, was from Poland. She alone among the kids in her family, the 4 or 5 or 6 kids, was sent to the United States to try to make it here, make money, bring the rest of the family over. And between the fact that she got here only a couple years before immigration restrictions were imposed in 1924, and then the Depression hit, and she was having trouble enough feeding her own family, she was never able to really get much money to her family to get out of Poland. And as a result, in a way that was very unnecessary and as I said before, tragic, she blamed herself for the death of her relatives in the Holocaust. She considered it her fault, and she wore that guilt like a millstone around her neck, but she also misapplied it. And in the course of my mother's young womanhood, I think I'd mentioned before, she had these two boyfriends more or less at the same time, one of whom was a very sweet Jewish guy who would have been a very approvable husband-to-be. But the guy she ends up loving more and really throwing over the other boyfriend for was an Italian Catholic fellow named Charlie Greco. And after he came back from the war and he fought in the Pacific Theater, and he and my mother wanted to get married, my grandmother could only, in her, traumatized way, associate Charlie, because he was not Jewish, with the Nazis who had killed her family. I mean, it's perverse, but viscerally, that was her feeling. And when my mother asked for permission to marry Charlie, my grandmother threatened to kill herself. And so my mother didn't marry him, but then held that incredible grudge against my grandmother for the rest of her life. So they were both, in a way, the collateral damage of the extermination of their relatives in Poland.
Oh, my gosh. And your mom, who can handle all of that? That definitely has to have an effect. And she was really still a child almost, your mom, even though she had to grow up. I mean, was she in her teens still, up in 20s maybe, when he came back from the war? When Charlie came back?
Well, yeah, she was, 21 years old when Charlie came back, and he was roughly the same age. But again, you have to remember, people grew up much faster than she had graduated high school. At 16, she'd been working and supporting her family since 17. Charlie, like her other boyfriend, High Celts, Charlie and High, had been to war in their teens and come back from war. So people were aged and seasoned, in their generation by their early 20s in ways it's hard to contemplate now.
Wow. How different life would have been had she said, "We're getting married." See you later.
I mean, I think, you put your finger on one of the mysteries, because on the one hand, my mother was a spirited, willful person who on most matters had no trouble at all defying her mother and kind of gloried in it. In a way, probably took a little too much fun out of it. And on the other hand, when it came to the most important thing in her life, which would have been being able to marry Charlie, that's the thing that she acceded to her mother's wishes on. And that was something I really wrestled with in the book, and what it brought me to was kind of a deeply sad insight, which is that I think that in some way my mother had a greater need to carry on the sense of aggrievement against her mother than her need to marry Charlie. Because that contempt she had for her mother was just one of the animating factors of her life for decades to come. Something I vividly remember from my own childhood.
But it wound up hurting her more than your grandmother, right?
Absolutely.
That's so unfortunate.
Well, it hurt my grandmother too, but my mother definitely inflicted a tremendous amount of damage on herself.
Right. Was it hard for you to go back and find the stories of her true love, Charlie, or the former boyfriends? Or because I know your mom and dad had a special relationship of their own.
Well, my parents had a complicated marriage. I mean, I would say, in summation, they were like wonderful friends and terrific parents, but probably shouldn't have been spouses. It was definitely a case of two, headstrong, passionate, opinionated personalities trying to operate in the same marriage, which can be exciting in many ways, and from intellectually to sexually, but also can be fraught with conflict, as it was. But they, as I said, had great intellectual respect for each other, had a great friendship. And when my mother was dying of cancer, my father, who worked in a field that was involved in manufacturing cancer research equipment, was absolutely valiant in doing everything he could to get her the best care available. But I don't, had heard my mother mention Charlie a handful of times when I was growing up. And I didn't know much about him, although I think I had some kind of visceral, uninformed sense that he was kind of the love of her life. And as I, did research for the book, that certainly was manifested, in talking to my mother's friends about the relationship with Charlie, talking to my mother's siblings, and ultimately, talking to Charlie's wife, the woman who also was Jewishly married, instead of marrying my mother. And Charlie himself had died by the time I was doing my research, but Selma Greco, very, very generously agreed to talk to me about a very difficult subject. And she helped me get to know some of Charlie's childhood friends who I introduced at length. And so it gave me really a profound sense of, of the connection between Charlie and my mom.
Sam, let's just backtrack a little bit. There's a portion of your book, I believe you and your mom and dad went to New Hampshire to visit your brother. He was a counselor in training up in New Hampshire at a summer camp. And your mom had forgotten her painkillers, and you were desperately trying to get someone to fill a prescription because she was in so much pain. This was when she was very sick. And you and your mom were left in the car, and your dad ran in to get the prescription filled at the 11th hour. And you said, do you ever think of just ending your life? And your mom's response was, not as long as there's one more great book to read, not as long as there's one more great play to see. Because you two are in the same writer's field. She was trying to become a writer later on in life.
Yeah, she had wanted to be a writer. She'd wanted to be a journalist when she was a teenager, and wrote wonderful essays for her school yearbook, and even when she was working the sort of Rosie the Riveter job during the war, was writing articles for the house organ of the company she worked for. And, later on when I was growing up, she was always taking short story writing classes and and some magazine writing classes, and always trying to sell this story or that story. So she definitely had, she had a real strong artistic yearning in a lot of ways. I mean, she was a hobby sculptor. She was a hobby painter. She, at one point, taught herself classical guitar. So the arts for her, like for me, were part of her life force. And I think life force is the phrase I want to, come back to again, because that's what I really got out of that moment, because I'd seen her, so whittled down physically as someone who was really comfortable in her own skin before she got ill with cancer, someone who really lived in her body very readily. To see that, body mutiny against her and undermine her was painful. And she was someone who, struggled with, bouts of, depression as well. And, knowing that you're ill with cancer in your late 40s is plenty of reason for anybody to feel depressed. So in spite of all that, to see her, at a time when she was just in such withering pain, still talk about the things that made her want to live was, profound for me, and was a really important insight for me into her then and now as well.
She was showing her true colors.
Yeah.
It's kind of nice that you got to see that. There's one funny story that I remember. I mean, there were many funny stories, and I love the stories of she and her girlfriends, or the guys all just going down to the certain corner where they all just hung out on the streets and got to see everybody, or the girls would go in the park and chat. I mean, it's just absolutely wonderful, and your writing is so descriptive and colorful. But there's one funny story about your mom, and she was having a problem with the electric bill or something, and she decided to march you guys down to the electric company and have a word.
Right. Something had interrupted our electric service at home, And my mother had been trying without luck to get the electric company to turn it back on from headquarters or to send a repair person out, whatever it was. And she was not getting any satisfaction on that front. So to force the electric company's hand, she brought my brother and sister and I into downtown New Brunswick, New Jersey, to the offices of Public Service Gas and Electric. And they had these window displays of these kind of automated kind of robots or cardboard characters, but with moving limbs that would look like sort of a kilowatt or, surge of electricity, lightning bolt, images like that. And we had always just been fascinated as kids with these and always begged to be able to go in the window there to play with them. We didn't realize that this was not a playground. And my mother remembered that, and so her way of forcing the electric company to deal with her, not having power at home was bring us down there and just turned us loose to go into the front display window and start messing around with their electric, electrified kind of cartoon figures. So it was a win-win. She got the power turned on, and we had a blast.
Oh, my gosh. But they realized how this wasn't going to stop, right? So to get her out of there, this crazy lady with her kids. I think my mom did that a couple of times with the 7 of us in tow. It seemed to work really well. Oh, my gosh. Sam Freedman. Now, should it be Samuel? Are all of your books Samuel Freedman?
All my books are Samuel, but for enjoyable conversing with you, it's Sam.
Okay. Well, I really, really appreciate that. And you do have, with just a couple of minutes left, tell us about you're working on something now, a new book.
Yeah, I'm working on a book that in some ways is very different than the book about my mother, but in some ways it's similar because it's the closest to a biography I've written since then, and it's set in a lot of the same period of time. But it's a book about Hubert Humphrey, who some of your listeners may remember, a senator, vice president, presidential candidate. But I'm writing about him during an earlier period of time in the 1930s and 40s when he's just beginning his political career and then becomes mayor of Minneapolis and has this hugely important role in what I call the civil rights movement, lowercase, before the civil rights movement, uppercase, by which I mean this period of time during the last couple of years of World War II and then the 4 or 5 years right after the war ended, when there's a tremendous amount of political mobilization to fight against racism and anti-Semitism in America. And Humphrey was an incredible leader in that, even though, of course, he was neither black nor Jewish, which in a way makes his efforts all the more stirring and valiant to me.
Hopefully we'll continue to have more and more activists advocating for those less fortunate, regardless of color,
absolutely.
creed, religion.
Absolutely.
More people to say what they really believe and be there for others and support one another. Thank you so much for joining us, Sam. I really appreciate it. And please do yourself a favor, all my listeners, because I appreciate all my great listeners, and check out Sam's work. Freedman is spelled F as Frank, R-E-E-D-M-A-N. Sam Freedman, thank you again for joining me on Should Have Listened to My Mother.
Thank you, Jackie. I really appreciate the chance to be on the show.
And again, another thank you to all of my listeners in the Ventura, California area listening on KPPQ-LP. This is Jackie Tantillo, and we will be back with another episode next week on Should Have Listened to My Mother.